I was standing in my own living room, surrounded by people I had fed, welcomed, and tried to keep comfortable for years when it happened. My daughter-in-law lifted her glass, smiled, and called me a burden. Not privately, not gently, but out loud, in front of everyone, as if my devotion had become something shameful. In that moment, I felt something crack that could never be repaired with apologies or time. I did not cry. I did not argue. I smiled and let her keep talking. Because sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that finally wake you up. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with emotion, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and I am 64 years old. I live alone in a quiet house beside a narrow lake in Washington state, the kind of place where mornings arrive slowly and evenings linger longer than expected. The house has stood here for decades, long before my hair went gray and long before silence became something I learned to live with. From the kitchen window, I can see the water most days, smooth and reflective, like it is always watching back. This house has seen every version of me, including the woman I no longer recognize and the one I am only beginning to understand. I became a widow 7 years ago. My husband's death was sudden, the kind that does not give you time to rehearse grief or prepare for the weight that follows. One moment, I was part of a partnership, and the next, I was responsible for everything: bills, decisions, emotional steadiness. I learned quickly how to function without falling apart. I told myself that strength meant not needing help and not showing how tired I was. I did what needed to be done because that was what survival required. My son Andrew was already grown by then, but grief does not respect age. He was my only child, and when his father died, I quietly made him the center of my world. Not because he asked, but because it felt natural. I had always been the kind of woman who took care of things. I worked in financial administration for most of my life, and responsibility never scared me. I helped Andrew through law school, supported him when he decided to open his own practice, and made sure he never felt alone while finding his footing. I did it gladly. I told myself that this was love. Over time, my role became fixed. I was the dependable one, the woman who always answered the phone, who adjusted her schedule without complaint, who offered help before anyone had to ask. I said yes automatically. Yes to hosting. Yes to helping. Yes to stepping back. I wore my reliability like a badge of honor, never questioning whether I was allowed to want more. It never occurred to me that always being available could one day be used as evidence against me. Somewhere along the way, my own life narrowed. I stopped making plans that did not involve my son. I let hobbies fade because they felt unnecessary. I told myself there would be time later when things settled down. I did not notice how quiet my own desires had become or how carefully I avoided becoming an inconvenience. I believed that love meant making yourself easy to keep around. When Andrew married Melissa, I tried to adapt without resistance. She was confident, polished, and very aware of how things looked from the outside. I admired her efficiency, even when it made me feel slightly out of place. I made an effort to be agreeable, to respect their space, to prove that I was not the kind of mother-in-law people warned about. I told myself that my job was to stay unobtrusive, to blend into the background of their life together. At the time, I believed silence was kindness and restraint was generosity. I believed that if I asked for nothing, I would never be accused of taking too much. I did not yet understand that by making myself smaller, I was teaching others how little space I expected to occupy. I thought I was doing everything right. I did not know that this quiet, carefully managed life was slowly leading me toward a moment that would change how I saw myself forever. If you're still watching and this opening feels uncomfortably familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Because what starts quietly in the story will soon explode in a way no one in that room was prepared for. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. In the months leading up to that New Year's Eve, nothing dramatic happened. There was no single argument, no clear rejection, nothing I could point to and say, this is where it broke. Instead, the change arrived quietly, in the way absence often does. Life continued at the same pace on the surface, but underneath, something had shifted, and I felt it even when I tried not to. Andrew used to call every Sunday afternoon. It was never a rule we discussed, just a rhythm we fell into over the years. Those calls became shorter, then less frequent. When they did come, they felt efficient, like items being checked off a list. He was busy. There was always a deadline, a client issue, a dinner he was already late for. I told myself that was normal, that successful adults had full lives. I did not want to be the mother who complained about not getting enough attention. Melissa's influence was subtle but steady. She never raised her voice or said anything openly unkind. Instead, she spoke in the language of modern self-awareness. Words like independence, boundaries, and emotional space appeared often, usually framed as virtues. I listened carefully, wanting to understand. I did not want to seem outdated or resistant to change. If the world was moving in a direction that required mothers to step back sooner, then I would step back. I told myself that love could be quiet. Slowly, the traditions I had relied on began to dissolve. Family dinners became occasional suggestions instead of standing plans. Holidays were discussed after decisions had already been made. I learned about them rather than being part of them. Each time, I adjusted my expectations a little lower so disappointment would not have room to grow. I told myself that this was maturity, that I was doing the right thing by not insisting on my place. There were moments, though, when the silence felt heavier than it should have. I would cook meals meant for more than one person and put the leftovers away untouched. I would hear my phone buzz and feel a flicker of anticipation before realizing it was not Andrew. I never mentioned this to anyone. I was proud of being self-sufficient, of not needing reassurance. Admitting loneliness felt like admitting weakness. When Andrew and Melissa asked if they could host a New Year's Eve party at my house, I agreed immediately. The request felt like proof that I still mattered, that I was still useful in the right way. My home was larger, more convenient, better suited for entertaining. I took comfort in that logic. If they needed my space, then they needed me, even if only indirectly. I threw myself into the preparation, planning menus, arranging seating, making lists, revisiting the role I knew how to play best. Hosting had always been something I was good at. It gave me a purpose, a reason to be involved without demanding anything emotional in return. As I worked, I imagined the night as a kind of reset, a celebration, a reminder that family was still family, even if it looked different now. Looking back, I can see how carefully I avoided asking myself harder questions. I did not ask why being needed always came with conditions. I did not ask why my presence felt welcome only when it was useful. I convinced myself that this was simply how relationships evolved over time, that closeness naturally faded and was replaced by polite distance. I went into that New Year's Eve believing that silence had protected me, that flexibility had kept the peace. I thought I was walking into a celebration. I did not know I was walking into a moment that would finally give a name to everything I had been trying not to see. If you're still here and sensing that something is about to go very wrong, comment number 2 below. The signs were there long before the words were spoken, and what happens next will change everything. Let's move on to chapter 3. The house looked exactly the way I had imagined it would that night. Every light was on, music drifted softly from room to room, and the air carried the overlapping sense of food and winter coats warming by the door. I moved through the space automatically, greeting guests, refilling glasses, smoothing small details that no one else noticed. Hosting had always felt natural to me. It gave my hands something to do and kept my thoughts pleasantly occupied. The guest list was a careful mix. Andrew's colleagues from his law firm stood in small clusters, speaking in measured voices about work and connections. Melissa's friends, polished and expressive, filled the room with easy laughter. Neighbors drifted in and out of conversations. I was aware, in a distant way, that this was not just a family gathering. It was a social performance, and my home had become the stage. As the evening went on, I noticed small things that unsettled me. Andrew stayed close to Melissa, more than usual, rarely drifting toward me unless spoken to. Melissa moved through the room with confidence, subtly directing the energy of the night, deciding when music changed and when attention shifted. I felt like a guest in my own house, present but not central, included but not consulted. I pushed the feeling aside. It was not my night, I told myself. It belonged to the younger generation now. By the time the clock neared midnight, everyone gathered in the living room. Glasses were raised, conversations softened, and the room leaned forward with anticipation. At 11:50, Melissa stepped closer to the fireplace and cleared her throat. The sound carried easily. I remember noticing how still the room became, how quickly attention settled on her. She spoke about the new year, about change and intention, about wanting life to feel healthier and more balanced. Her tone was warm, confident, familiar to anyone who had ever listened to someone speak professionally about growth. Heads nodded. I nodded too, without really thinking about it. Then her focus shifted. She talked about boundaries, about the importance of independence, about how difficult it could be to build a future when the past lingered too closely. When she looked directly at me, I felt the room turn with her. The word burden landed softly, almost politely, but it carried enough weight to silence everything else. It hung there, unmistakable, impossible to misunderstand. I became acutely aware of my body. The glass in my hand felt suddenly heavier. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. For a brief moment, instinct urged me to speak, to explain, to defend myself. I could have reminded everyone how this house existed because I had built a life around my family. I could have asked why this conversation was happening here, now, in front of all these people. I did none of that. Instead, I smiled. It was not a performance. It was not submission. It was the expression that appears when something clicks into place and there is no longer any confusion. In that moment, I understood that this was not a slip or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. This was a declaration, carefully timed and publicly delivered. Around me, people shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my eyes. Others watched me closely, as if waiting to see what role I would choose to play. I stayed exactly where I was. I let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed. The countdown began moments later, voices joining together with a forced enthusiasm. When midnight arrived, cheers filled the room, but they sounded distant, as though I were hearing them through water. Glasses clinked, people hugged. Life moved forward, as it always does. I stood there smiling, already aware that something fundamental had changed. The woman I had been before that moment no longer fit the room I was standing in. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to make myself smaller to make everyone else comfortable. If you're still watching and felt that moment land like a punch to the chest, comment number 3 below, because the real shock isn't what was said, it's what happened right after. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After the last guest left, the house felt unnaturally large. The music had stopped, but its echo lingered in my ears. Half-empty glasses lined the counter, fingerprints clouding their surfaces. Plates sat abandoned where people had set them down without a thought. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, letting the silence settle. It felt heavier than the crowd ever had. I cleaned because it was something I could control. I rinsed glasses, stacked plates, wiped counters that were already clean. The repetition steadied me. Each motion gave me a reason not to think about the way the room had turned toward me, the way the word had landed and stayed. When I finally went to bed, the clock glowed well past 2 in the morning. Sleep did not come easily. My mind replayed fragments of the night, not in sharp flashes, but in dull, persistent loops. Faces, pauses, the moment I smiled. Morning arrived without relief. Light filtered through the windows as if nothing had happened. I made coffee and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, staring at a spot on the wall I had looked at 1,000 times before. I felt exposed, as though something private had been taken from me and displayed without my consent. I told myself not to dramatize it. I had survived worse things. This was just a conversation, I said. Just words. Andrew called mid-morning. His voice was calm, careful, the way it gets when he wants to smooth something over. He spoke about the party, about how late it had run, about how everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. Then he mentioned Melissa. He said she had not meant anything personally. He said she had been talking about growth, about building their life as a couple. He asked if I understood. I listened without interrupting. I heard what he did not say. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that something inappropriate had happened. The focus stayed firmly on my reaction, on whether I would make this difficult. I told him I was fine. I said I understood. The words came out easily, shaped by years of practice. After we hung up, I sat very still. The quiet returned, but it was different now. It carried clarity with it. Andrew had not called to ask how I felt. He had called to make sure I would not disrupt the order of things. That realization hurt more than the comment itself. I had always believed that if I remained reasonable, if I stayed calm and accommodating, I would be met with the same care. Instead, I was being asked to absorb the impact so everyone else could move on comfortably. I tried to tell myself that this was a misunderstanding, that time would soften it. But another part of me, one I had learned to ignore, was paying attention. I noticed how quickly my feelings had been minimized. I noticed how easily my discomfort had been reframed as an obstacle to harmony. I noticed that the solution being offered required nothing from anyone else. By the afternoon, exhaustion settled in. Not the kind that comes from lack of sleep, but the deeper kind that follows recognition. I understood then that this was not a single incident. It was the natural result of years spent making myself easy to overlook. I had taught them how to treat me by never asking for more. I sat alone in the living room as the light shifted across the floor, thinking about how often I had adjusted myself to keep peace. For the first time, I did not feel the urge to explain or defend. Something in me had gone quiet, not from defeat, but from decision. I did not yet know what that decision would look like. I only knew that continuing as before was no longer an option. If you're still with me and starting to realize this wasn't just a misunderstanding, comment number 4 below. From this point on, the story shifts, and the consequences become impossible to ignore. Let's continue. The days after New Year's Eve moved differently. Nothing around me had changed, yet everything felt altered. I woke up later, lingered longer over simple tasks, and noticed how often my mind drifted back to moments I had never examined closely before. I was no longer trying to justify what had happened or explain it away. I was observing it, calmly and honestly, for the first time. I began thinking about Andrew when he was young, long before law school and careers and carefully curated lives. I remembered how fiercely I protected him after his father died, how quickly I stepped into the role of being everything at once: provider, encourager, stabilizer. I told myself that love meant shielding him from discomfort, even when it cost me my own. I did not see that I was also teaching him something else, that my needs were optional, that my presence required no care because it would never leave. As those memories surfaced, patterns emerged that I could no longer ignore. Every time Andrew struggled, I adjusted. Every time he pulled away, I leaned back without protest. I praised independence while quietly offering a safety net that never disappeared. I convinced myself that this balance was healthy, that it made me a good mother. But looking at it now, I saw how unbalanced it had always been. For the first time, I stopped placing all the weight of this moment on Melissa. It would have been easier to make her the villain, to believe that everything had been fine until she arrived. But that explanation felt incomplete. She had not created this dynamic from nothing. She had simply stepped into a structure that already existed and learned how to use it. The uncomfortable truth was that I had helped build it. That realization did not absolve her, but it changed the shape of my anger. My focus shifted inward, not with blame, but with clarity. I saw how my silence had become an invitation, how my constant accommodation had taught others that discomfort belonged to me alone. I had spent years protecting Andrew from feeling torn, and in doing so, I had ensured that I would be the one who absorbed every fracture. Seeing Andrew clearly was the hardest part, not as my child, but as a grown man who had learned to avoid emotional responsibility because someone else always carried it for him. He was not cruel. He was comfortable with the arrangement that allowed him to move forward without looking back, accepting that hurt more than any insult could have. There was grief in that understanding, the quiet kind that does not announce itself. I mourned the image of my son I had held onto for too long, the one who would eventually notice and correct what was wrong. I realized that waiting for that moment had kept me suspended in place. It had allowed me to excuse behavior that slowly eroded my sense of worth. I did not cry then. I felt something steadier than tears, a heavy, grounded awareness that things could not return to how they were, not because of pride or resentment, but because returning would require me to forget what I now understood, and I knew I could not unlearn it. By the end of that week, I had not spoken to Andrew or Melissa again, not out of spite, but because I was no longer in a hurry to smooth things over. I was sitting with the truth, letting it settle fully. I did not yet know what action I would take. I only knew that continuing as I had been was no longer possible. Whatever came next would have to be built on something different, something that did not require me to disappear in order to belong. I did not announce my decision to anyone. There was no speech, no confrontation, no moment where I declared that things would now be different. Change arrived quietly, the same way the problem had. I simply stopped reaching outward. For years, I had been the one to initiate contact, to check in, to make sure nothing drifted too far apart. This time, I did nothing. I waited, not as a test, but as an experiment in truth. The silence felt different when it was chosen. It was not empty or accusing. It was deliberate. Days passed without calls or messages, and I noticed how quickly my body relaxed when I was not anticipating the sound of my phone. I began to understand how much energy I had spent managing expectations that were never spoken aloud. Letting go of that habit felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible, but also strangely honest. With the space I created, something else emerged. I began to structure my days around myself rather than availability. I returned to routines I had once enjoyed and replaced others entirely. I walked longer paths along the lake, joined a local discussion group, and volunteered a few mornings a week at a community center that offered financial guidance to women my age. These were not grand gestures, they were practical ones. Each choice reminded me that my time still had value, even when it was not being claimed by someone else. The emotional adjustment was not simple. There were moments when the house felt too quiet, when old instincts urged me to reach out and smooth the distance. I questioned whether I was being cold or withholding. But each time I sat with that discomfort, I recognized it for what it was: habit breaking itself apart. I was not punishing anyone. I was learning how not to abandon myself. Around this time, I also took care of a matter I had avoided thinking about for years. When Andrew opened his law practice, I had quietly signed as a personal guarantor on a line of credit. It was something I did without discussion, believing it was part of supporting him. Reviewing my documents now, I saw that support in a new light. Without drama or explanation, I arranged for my guarantor status to end. The firm was stable. Andrew was capable. My involvement was no longer necessary, and continuing it felt inconsistent with everything I was beginning to understand. I did not tell him. I did not need to. This was not leverage or revenge. It was alignment. I was removing myself from roles I had assumed out of obligation rather than choice. For the first time, my actions matched the reality of our relationship instead of the version I had hoped for. What surprised me most was the sense of steadiness that followed. I expected fear, maybe regret. Instead, I felt grounded. There was strength in not explaining myself, in letting my boundaries exist without justification. I did not need to name them. They were evident in what I no longer did. As weeks passed, I understood that consequences would come. People who are used to your constant presence notice when it disappears. Questions would be asked. Interpretations would be formed. I could not control that. And for once, I did not try. I stayed with my choices, trusting that clarity would reveal itself over time. I was no longer positioning myself for approval or inclusion. I was standing still in my own life, allowing others to meet me there if they chose. Whatever came next would unfold naturally. I had made my decision, not out of anger, but out of respect for myself, and I was prepared to live with what that decision would bring. If you're still watching and notice the power quietly changing hands, comment number 6 below. What happens next will prove that silence can be far more unsettling than confrontation. Now, let's move on to chapter 7. The first sign that something had shifted came quietly, almost cautiously. After weeks of silence, my phone began to light up again. A short message from Andrew asking how I was doing, a missed call without a voicemail, another message a few days later, phrased lightly, as if nothing unusual had happened. I noticed the change immediately, not because I was waiting for it, but because I was no longer bracing myself against disappointment. The difference mattered. I did not rush to respond, not out of calculation, but because my days no longer revolved around the expectation of contact. When I did reply, I kept it simple and kind. No explanations, no emotional accounting. I answered as a person with a full life, not as someone standing by for reassurance. The restraint felt unfamiliar, but it also felt honest. Andrew's tone shifted quickly. His messages became more frequent, his questions more personal. He asked if I was feeling well, if everything was all right. There was a subtle unease beneath the concern, a sense that something was out of alignment and he did not know how to name it. For years, my presence had been constant, predictable. Now it was not, and that unsettled him. Melissa reached out indirectly. She suggested getting together sometime, framed as a friendly check-in, as though the distance had simply been a scheduling issue. Her language was careful, softened by pleasant intentions. I could feel the effort to restore a sense of normalcy without revisiting what had disrupted it. I recognized the pattern immediately. Harmony was being offered, but only if it did not require accountability. I watched all of this with a surprising calm. I did not feel triumphant or vindicated. I felt observant. It became clear to me that my absence was being noticed not because I was missed emotionally, but because I was no longer available in the way I once was. I was no longer easy to predict or manage. That change altered the balance more than any argument could have. Andrew eventually said that I seemed different. The word was not accusation exactly, but it carried weight. It implied deviation, as though I had stepped outside an unspoken agreement. I did not correct him. I did not reassure him. I allowed the statement to exist without response. My behavior was the answer. What I resisted most strongly was the impulse to explain myself. I had spent so many years translating my choices into language that would keep others comfortable. Now, I let my actions speak. I returned calls when it suited me. I declined invitations without apology. I shared parts of my life without offering them up for approval. Each small decision reinforced the boundary I had never been allowed to name before. There were moments of tension, moments when I could sense frustration just beneath the surface. But there was also a new kind of respect taking shape, tentative and unsteady. When people are used to you yielding, your steadiness can feel like resistance. I accepted that discomfort without trying to resolve it. As time passed, I understood that this phase would not last forever. Either the distance would harden into separation, or it would lead to a more honest reckoning. I could not control which path it would take. What I could control was my position within it. I was no longer negotiating for space. I was occupying it. I moved forward with a quiet confidence, aware that a deeper conversation was still waiting ahead. When it came, I knew I would meet it differently than I ever had before. Andrew asked to meet a week later. The message was careful, neutral, framed as a desire to clear the air. I agreed without hesitation, not because I expected resolution, but because I was no longer afraid of hearing what would be said. I suggested my house and chose a time that worked for me. That detail mattered. For once, the rhythm of the conversation would not be set by someone else's urgency. When he arrived, he looked around as if seeing the space for the first time. The room was the same, but I was not. We sat across from each other with the lake visible through the window, its surface steady and indifferent. I noticed how quickly he began to speak, as though momentum might replace substance. He talked about family, about how misunderstandings grow when people stop communicating. He said the past few weeks had felt strained and unnecessary. I listened. I did not interrupt or rush him. I let the words settle and show their shape. What stood out most was what he avoided. He did not name the moment that had fractured everything. He did not mention the word that had been spoken or the room full of people who had heard it. The conversation hovered around the edges of the truth, careful not to land on it. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice even. I told him that this was not about distance or independence or evolving relationships. It was about being called a burden in my own home, in front of people who would remember it long after the champagne was gone. I said that this was not a matter of interpretation or tone. It was an act of public dismissal. His response came quickly, rehearsed in spirit, if not in words. He said it had not been meant that way. He said Melissa had been trying to express something clumsily. He asked if I could let it go so everyone could move forward. The request was familiar. It asked me to absorb the discomfort so things could return to a version of normal that worked for them. I told him that letting it go was not the same as resolving it. I said I was not asking for closeness or reassurance. I was asking for acknowledgement, for responsibility, for a clear understanding that what happened was wrong, not awkward or unfortunate, but wrong. I explained that without that recognition, there was nothing to build on. The room felt tighter then. Andrew shifted in his seat, his frustration surfacing in small ways. He spoke about intentions again, about how dwelling on one moment could overshadow years of support. I recognized the pivot immediately. The past was being used as leverage against the present. Gratitude was being positioned as a substitute for respect. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or list my sacrifices. I simply repeated what I needed and what I would not accept. My calm seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. He was searching for a way through that did not require him to confront his own role in the situation. When it became clear that I would not provide one, the conversation stalled. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that confirms rather than questions. I understood then that this was the limit of what he could offer, not cruelty, but avoidance, not rejection, but refusal. It was enough to make a choice clear. When he left, there was no resolution, only recognition. I closed the door and stood there, breathing in the quiet. I felt the weight of what had not been said, and also the steadiness of what I had finally allowed myself to say. A door had not been slammed, it had simply closed. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that it would not be reopened the same way again. If you're still here and feel the weight of that conversation lingering, comment number 8 below. Because the ending of this story is not what most people expect, and it may stay with you long after it's over. Let's move on to the final chapter. After Andrew left, the house settled into a quiet that felt earned rather than imposed. I stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the soft tick of the clock and the distant movement of water outside. There was no rush of relief, no dramatic release, just a steady awareness that something had ended and that its ending did not require explanation. Our contact changed after that. Messages came occasionally, polite and measured, stripped of familiarity. Birthdays were acknowledged with brief notes. Holidays passed without invitations or conflict. The absence of tension felt strange at first, like a room rearranged without asking. But over time, I adjusted. The ache softened into something manageable, a dull reminder rather than a sharp wound. I learned that distance can be painful without being destructive. I allowed myself to grieve what I had lost without turning that grief into doubt. Some mornings, I missed the idea of my son more than the reality of our relationship. I missed the version of closeness I had believed in, the one that assumed mutual care. Accepting that it was no longer available felt like setting down a heavy object I had carried for too long. My arms ached afterward, but they were free. My days continued to fill in ways I had not anticipated. The community center became a place where I was valued for my experience rather than my availability. Conversations there were direct, practical, and respectful. I found myself laughing more easily, speaking without apology, listening without waiting for permission to respond. The balance felt natural, not earned through sacrifice, but built on mutual regard. Friendships deepened slowly. These were relationships without history to manage or expectations to meet. We met for walks, shared meals, talked about work and aging, and plans that extended beyond obligation. I noticed how different it felt to be seen as a whole person rather than a role that existed in service to someone else. That recognition steadied me in ways I had not known I needed. There were moments when guilt surfaced, uninvited and persistent. Old instincts whispered that I should try harder, that motherhood required endless accommodation. I acknowledged those thoughts without acting on them. I reminded myself that choosing dignity was not abandonment. It was alignment. I could hold love and limits at the same time, even if others could not. As months passed, the decision I had made proved itself through repetition. Each quiet holiday, each unanswered expectation, reinforced the truth I had learned. My life no longer depended on approval. It moved forward on its own terms, shaped by choices that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I had been required to be. I did not feel victorious. There was no sense of having won anything. What I felt instead was grounded, rooted in a reality that did not shift based on someone else's comfort. The cost of this clarity was real, but it was also finite. Losing myself had been far more expensive. Standing by the lake one evening, watching the light fade across the water, I understood that this was the outcome I could live with. Not perfect, not painless, but honest. I had kept my integrity, even when it meant letting go. And in doing so, I had made room for a life that belonged fully to me. Another New Year's Eve arrived quietly. No crowded living room, no raised glasses, no carefully arranged conversations. I spent the evening at home, alone by choice, with the lake outside my window reflecting the winter sky. The stillness did not feel empty. It felt intentional. I made dinner for myself, lit a single candle, and let the hours pass without needing them to mean anything more than what they were. As midnight approached, I thought about the previous year and the woman I had been then. I remembered how tightly I held my composure, how instinctively I smiled when the room turned against me. At the time, I believed that smile was a shield, something to hide behind until the discomfort passed. Now I understood it differently. That smile marked the moment I stopped explaining myself. It was the instant I realized that defending my worth would only give others the power to question it. So much had changed since then, not in dramatic gestures, but in orientation. I no longer waited for permission to feel settled. I no longer interpreted silence as rejection or distance as failure. I learned that not every relationship evolves into something kinder, and that truth does not always arrive with closure. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of clarity that refuses to be undone. I thought about Andrew, not with bitterness, but with a calm acceptance I had not known before. He was living his life, shaped by choices I could not control. I had stopped measuring my well-being by his approval or attention. Loving him no longer required me to disappear. It required honesty with myself, even when that honesty carried loss with it. The most surprising part of this year was not what I let go of, but what I gained. I gained time that belonged to me. I gained relationships that did not depend on my willingness to sacrifice. I gained a sense of internal authority, the kind that does not need to announce itself to be real. I learned that dignity is not something others grant. It is something you practice, often in silence. As midnight came and went, I did not mark it with a toast. I marked it with awareness. I stood by the window and watched the lights across the water flicker briefly and fade. I felt present in my own life in a way I had not for years. There was no audience, no judgment to anticipate, no role to perform, just me, exactly where I was meant to be. I returned again to that moment a year ago, when I smiled and let her keep talking. I had thought then that I was enduring something. I see now that I was beginning something. I was choosing not to argue for space, but to claim it through my actions. I was deciding that my worth did not require consensus. That decision did not make my life perfect. It made it honest. And honesty, I have learned, is far more sustaining than approval. I closed the curtain, turned off the light, and went to bed with a sense of quiet completion. The night that once marked my humiliation had become the beginning of my freedom. And that freedom, earned slowly and kept carefully, was mine to carry forward into whatever came next. What remains after the noise fades is not anger, not victory, and not regret, but clarity. Some endings do not come with apologies or neat resolutions. They arrive quietly, asking us to decide whether we will continue shrinking to preserve connection or stand fully in who we are, even if it costs us familiarity. Growth is rarely loud. More often, it looks like choosing honesty over harmony, dignity over approval, and self-respect over the comfort of being needed. When we stop waiting for others to recognize our value, we begin to live from a place that cannot be taken away. Loss may still exist, but it no longer defines us. In that space, something steadier takes root, a life shaped by intention, not permission. Thank you for spending this time with the story. If it resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters. Please consider subscribing and following the channel so we can continue exploring stories that speak to strength, boundaries, and becoming whole.